Welcome to the Lubber's Hole, the Patrick O'Brian podcast. You're with Ian.
And with Mike.
And together we are rereading the Aubrey Maturin novels of our favourite novelist, Patrick O'Brian. Mike, where did we get to last week? What's in store for this week?
Oh, thanks, Ian. Yes. Jack last week discovered that Stephen, who we didn't know was Stephen last week, speaks Catalan, loves natural philosophy, and is a physician. Learning that he's a physician, he asked Stephen to consider being the Sophie's surgeon. Jack received his orders to convey a bunch of merchant ships along with his new lieutenant, James Dillion, who we discovered may or may not have an Irish connection with Stephen. Mr. Brown, Jack's musical friend, lectured Jack on not wasting nautical supplies. Stephen mourned the loss of an old Irish love and the patient that brought him to Mahan. And the Sophie, as we closed out the chapter, received a bunch of new hands. Now, Jack wants 2 new cannons and a new main yard.
Yeah, me too, man.
That's right. It was on my Christmas list, right? That's what I told Santa. Oh, well, this time, Jack works to equip the Sophie to meet his needs. So we're back to those needs here. Stephen weighs the decision to become a surgeon on board here. Jack learns more about his new ship as the crew and Lieutenant Dillion try to figure out their new captain. Now, there's opera, bowdlerization, nautical innovation, and some of our favorite phrases packed into a very long day.
Yeah. And we're still only in chapter 2. It's amazing.
Right.
Meanwhile, Mike, before we get further into chapter 2, before we get deeper into this long day for Jack and the crew of the Sophie, we wanted to share a guest interview with you. We got together with our old friend James Albright to talk about the natural historical world, the natural philosophical world that has been at the front of Stephen's mind already in this chapter and is going to play a big part in the rest of the book. We're really happy to welcome back to the show today our old friend James Albright. James works by day as an environmental specialist, but his background is in biology and with a master's in evolution and ecology. James, it seems like you're our guy for natural history, and Stephen Maturin might even say natural philosophy. Is that fair?
That's perfect.
Thanks and welcome to the show. Back earlier in the book, we have Stephen Maturin flashing out the Latin name of the hoopoe, and he mentions Linnaeus. Tell us a little bit about Linnaeus and the role that he plays and how that fits into all this naming and discovery of species.
Sure, yeah. I mean, ultimately, you think all human cultures have made efforts to classify things, and whether they're hunter-gatherers or different complex city-dwelling societies, and we all want to have a handle on things. So in the Western tradition, it kind of goes back as the root is in Aristotle with his Scala Naturae, the ladder of nature, where he ranked things. And the approach he used, well, he was kind of just looking at different characters and lumping things together. But one thing that his followers took from him was his logical approach, where it was this kind of dichotomization. So you'd ask, is it this or this? Is it this or this? And you could work down from the top to the more specific. And that's the classification that was handed down through the Middle Ages and to the Renaissance. And you had this tradition of herbalists and encyclopedists who were trying to, just for utility, lump all these different plants and animals together so in one place, often just kind of listed alphabetically, but sometimes they would try to lump them on different features. They were often using, because Latin was the language of scholarship, so they would often use kind of descriptive names, which would kind of later evolve into the shorter species scientific names. One of the things that actually is mentioned by Maturin, he talks about John Ray and Francis Willoughby, who went and did a 17th century expedition across Europe. Willoughby was more on the animal side, he's an ornithologist and ichthyologist, and Ray was more of a botanist. And sadly, Willoughby died young. Ray actually completed both of their publications, and it was some of the earliest real rigorous attempt to try and come up with a classification system. And what we're trying to do today in our modern classification systems post-Darwin is to try and reflect the common ancestry to a degree, which of course was not part of the idea there. They were just trying to see what God's pattern, like he had like this plan, and we're trying to reflect the plan, this kind of natural theology point of view. So then moving on to Linnaeus. Linnaeus was a rock star in the 18th century.
Wow.
He was like one of the most famous naturalists, Carl von Linné originally. He Latinized his name.
Wow.
Actually, it's kind of funny that I guess Ray also changed his name because he was originally spelled the W, but he went to spelling it with an R without the W. But Linnaeus was a botanist who did a number of publications, including his Systema Naturae, and it's the system that really caught on. He had a ranked system with kingdom, phylum, class. He didn't have families and orders yet, but his kingdoms included animal, vegetable, mineral. Mm-hmm. So he was putting in things that weren't living into his classification system. But he was trying to apply these techniques to organize things. And he was particularly interested in the genus. He was focused on the genus level, which is, when we think about it today, we think of species as being the fundamental unit because they are biologically integral. If you look at Ernst Mayer's species definition, they are units that cannot interbreed with other species. But a genus is a clustering of closely related species. Now, for Linnaeus, that was the fundamental unit that he created as this natural unit. And everything else was he expressed as artificial above that. So it caught on. That was the system that was used. Once we moved to a more evolutionary idea, they had to kind of kludge it together. But he's still considered the father of taxonomy.
Wow. So we've had a couple of Latin names for species already. We've had Upupa epops, the hoopoe, in chapter 1, and we've had Boletus edulis, the set mushroom, in chapter 2.
Right.
How do those fit in? Are they pre-Linnaean, post-Darwinian, something else?
Let's see. Upupa epops, I believe that was originally described. So the description of a species is when we first describe a species, we put the characters and we connect it to a type specimen. Right. And wasn't quite as formalized back then. So I'm not sure on who originally described the hoopoe.
By the way, it appears as though the two parts of the name have some origin in being onomatopoeic. They're partly recalling the call of the bird.
Call. Yes, I do remember that. Yeah, but the bolets, the mushrooms, that's a weird one because the genus Boletus was something that Linnaeus came up with. Mm-hmm. So the text actually says, Linnaeus's Boletus edulis, but then he actually didn't describe that species. He created the genus, and he just created it as this kind of big catch-all. It was all mushrooms which had pores instead of gills, which is a big hodgepodge.
Wow.
It was actually described by Pierre Bouillard in 1782. And the name just means mushroom edible. So it can be it.
It can be it. A great O'Brien mushroom. In the discussion between Aubrey and Matron in chapter 2, Jack is telling Stephen that he's made such good use of his childhood, and Stephen, kind of vehemently disagrees because he missed all this opportunity for natural studies in this area in Catalonia where he was growing up. So you want to tell us a little bit about some of the things that Stephen's referring to there?
Sure, yeah. He does a bit of name dropping. He references Ray and Willoughby, who we spoke about in terms of their contributions to classification. Willoughby specifically, had gone through Spain and had done an early survey, but that was from over 100 years prior. So since then, no naturalists had really dug in. Matron names drops Peter Pallas, who was a Prussian naturalist, famous for an expedition to Russia. David Solander, who was a Swedish naturalist and a student of Linnaeus. And then he also references the Melins family, Gmelins, a very big family, German family in terms of 18th century science, medicine, chemistry. The ones he specifically seems to be referencing are the elder, who would accompany Vitus Bering on the Kamchatka expedition, and then the younger Melin, who was involved in an expedition to Persia to collect specimens for Linnaeus, actually.
Wow.
Stephen also talks about his own contributions and modestly, and references his work in Ireland, and talks about the Fenerograms of Upper Ossuary, which is, I believe, in Kilkenny.
And a phenerogram is?
Yeah, Fenerogram is what we would call today a spermatophyte. So a spermatophyte is a seed-bearing land plant. Phenerogram just refers to the reproductive organs, which is what this is focusing on. So phaneros is just visible, and gramma means marriage. They also reference cryptograms,
right,
which are ones which have hidden reproductive parts. And that actually was something that was a focus of botanists. Like Linnaeus was very focused on reproduction. Erasmus Darwin, Charles's grandfather, actually was a little bit considered racy for his salacious poetry about plant reproduction. A little bit risque for the time.
Well, these days, I'm sure there's somewhere on the internet where people are kind of downloading that kind of stuff, but who knows?
And I'm sure O'Brien would have been, richly mining that for some of his little jokes.
Mm-hmm.
Listening to you, James, it sounds like this marriage of, natural philosophers and the world of the Navy, a very much a thing at that time.
Oh, yeah. Certainly the opportunity to see all these new species. That was one of the things, too, when I referenced the 17th century Age of Discovery era with encyclopedists and herbalists moving towards more rigorous kinds of classification. Part of the reason for that was just the explosion in number of known species. So like in around 1600, there were about 6,000 known species of plants. Mm-hmm. And by the end of the century, it was double that. Mm-hmm. So they were very quickly accumulating large numbers of species. They had to try and figure out how they all fit together. And they were also thinking about it in this kind of idea of God's plan. Like when you looked at people like Newton, the physicists were doing in the 17th century, it was very much, we're discovering these natural laws that give us some idea of God's plan and for the universe. So the people on the biological side wanted to uncover the same sort of things.
I wondered, do you know a little bit about O'Brien and his naturalist interests? I mean, we see him writing in his kind of Norton newsletter early in his first visits to the U.S. He's so excited about his opportunities to go birding, but he's not just a birder. He seems to have a deeper interest in this and certainly a great knowledge. Any idea about Brian's background or his interest in this?
I don't actually. I mean, it's apparent that he is very passionate and interested. He did write a biography of Sir Joseph Banks. And that one certainly was a marriage of his interest in the era, his interest in the sailing, and of course in natural history, because Banks, of course, famously made his name accompanying Cook on the HMS Endeavour and was head of the Royal Society for a
by the way,
time.
You've probably heard us mention it in the show. We've noticed that his first and very famous musical reference was a little bit wide of the mark. His first natural history references have been absolutely spot on and really, really deep in their associations.
There's a few things. I noticed the beautiful scene in chapter 2 where he talks about Maturin waking up with this kind of evocative smell, and he's thinking of a woman.
Right.
But it turns out he just had been lying on Dianthus. And Dianthus is a real genus. It was described by Linnaeus originally. It's a very widespread, the pinks.
Right.
But the actual species per fragrance, I can't find any reference to that as a real species.
Oh, well done, James. So it's kind of fun that, in those early chapters, Ian with a background in music, Ian, you're spotting one out, James with your background, you're spotting another. But he writes it so well, which I think goes back to the point I think we always make so much to say, have fun. There's some of this stuff that is fascinating to dig into. And there's some of it, it's just like warp drive. I mean, it doesn't have to exist. We're just, it's a creation of the world. What a great name. That's what I would call that.
Yeah, no, it's a wonderful scientific name. It's quite plausible. I just haven't been able to find it. Reference
right. Fascinating.
Kind of like this Pseudo Albreae, there's no giant tortoise of that name. There's several other biological references in chapter 2. Like he references Tapenoma erraticum, described by Luttrell in 1789, which is the erratic ant. And he talks about their behavior in a very authentic fashion. They do behave foraging kind of erratically. And he talks about them kind of almost as if like Stephen's just kind of annoyed by them, and they kind of go along with hold their abdomens high up in the air. And they're a common European ant. And he talks about the splendid toad, which I assume has to be the Balearic green toad, because one thing about islands, and this is kind of a thing about island biogeography in terms of where plants and animals are distributed, you often have a depauperate herpetofauna, a lack of amphibians and certain reptiles on islands, because how do they get there?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Interesting.
Yeah, they can either ride somewhere. If an island breaks apart, it's called vicariance. But if you have a new surface of land out far away, it can be really hard, especially for something like a toad that cannot live in the salt water, to get there. So the hypothesis in this case is that dispersal was humanated, that people brought these toads to the island, probably from Italy originally. Stephen talks about the plants there and the climate and how the recent years has been very dry.
Right.
And how does the toad survive so well? He talks about the caper bushes, and he's even mentioning things like gladiolus plant, snakeskin. Again, not very many reptiles. Probably the ladder snake. There's only like 3 species of snakes that I could find on Minorca. They mentioned the birds too, of course. Yeah. Particular favorites of Maturin. So we've got the black wheat ear, which I've seen, and they're very beautiful bird of cliffs and rocky slopes and mountainous areas. And of course, he references seeing smaller eagles. I'm guessing it's probably a booted eagle. They're very small. It also could be Bonelli's or another species of eagle in that area. But that's all just in like this one that's like one page.
Yeah. Right. A couple of paragraphs. Yeah.
Yeah.
So thanks very much, James.
Thank you, guys.
I wanted to ask you what you're up to nowadays and what's ahead for 2022.
On my part, I'm still working for the Florida Department of Environmental Protection.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm glad it's appreciated. It's very important work. We work in the Total Maximum Daily Load program. So that's actually something that comes out of the Clean Water Act. For waters that are found to be impaired, we do modeling and determine how much the pollutants incoming need to be reduced in order to restore the natural designated uses of the water, being fishable, swimmable, that sort of thing. And so that's what I've been working on, and that's what I'm still doing. It's kind of exciting.
Well, James, listen, thanks very much. It's been really, really great to have you on the show. Thank you once again for joining us, and we wish you a successful 22, and we hope we'll chat again soon.
Thank you. Awesome. I'm always happy to come on. If you ever want to go into obscure bits of taxonomy, it's a lot of fun.
Awesome.
Fantastic.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Boy, I really love talking to James Albright, and I learn about a dozen new things every time, which brings us back, Ian. So when we stopped last week, Jack's boat had just pulled up at the shore of the ordnance yard. What happened next?
Well, Jack's in fix-it mode. He's held back a little bit though, because he's got to take precedence. He's got to stand in his due place in the line. He's behind several captains who are queuing up, including Captain Middleton, whose personal connections had allowed him to get command of this virtuose, a French privateer that Jack's pretty sure should have been his. Anyhow, Middleton is there. He tells Jack that Mr. Head, who runs the ordnance yard, is, to use his great phrase here, selling off all his stock like a fishwife at the end of the fair, because Head is due to be placed under Mr. Brown, who we've heard of before as well, who runs the rest of the dockyard. Jack had heard this somewhere else. Now, Middleton, with a pinch of conscience, who I guess can see that Jack is kind of hopping from one foot to the other, hot to be on his way, Middleton gives way and says Jack can go before him. And we're as surprised as Jack is to be suddenly at the front of the line here. Jack tells this guy, Mr. Head, that he'd like to try some new hardware, specifically 2 long 12-pounders, cannons, to go aboard the Sophie as chasers. And Head has some reasons to be doubtful. Sophie's only a small brig. He checks to be sure that Jack knows how much they weigh, these guns. And Jack says he does, and he's aware that they're pretty big and pretty powerful for the ship, and he says he's going to try it anyway to see if the timbers will stand it. And Head says, knock yourself out. Have a dozen, Captain, if you feel she will bear them. They are yours then, and upon your own head be it. And Jack says thank you, and thinks to himself, well, I wish the rest of the service could be run this way. And Mr. Head joins in this little reflection on the nature of the Royal Navy life. So do I, Captain. So do I, cried Mr. Head, his face growing suddenly dark with passion. There are some slack-assed, bloody-minded men, flute-playing, fiddle-scraping, present-seeking, tail-bearing, double-poxed hounds that would keep you waiting about for a month, but I am not one of them. And Mike, I don't think it's a secret that he's referring to this other guy, Brown, here, who's the one whose duets Jack wants to borrow, but there's clearly not a lot of love lost between Brown and Head here in the yard.
No, there certainly is not. But, Jack's thrilled. He's got this, expeditious Mr. Head moving them right along there. And he takes the paper that Mr. Head gives him and takes it to the Master Parker, the man who's going to be in charge of actually, trundling out these cannons for Jack. And at first, the Master Parker is very helpful. And then all of a sudden, he has a vast number of reasons why it's really going to take some time to get them. And he leaves Jack waiting. And Jack is really, upset now. He's kind of going from foot to foot. He's looking at his watch constantly, looking at the Sophie, which is right there close to shore, ready for the cannon, sees that men are starting to get drunk. Anytime they're this close to shore, that's temptation. And he needs to get out on this trial cruise early to be back in time to lead the convoy tonight. He's frustrated, and then he realizes, as he puts it, that he forgot the oil. And Jack calls the Master Parker over, right? Says that he forgot to, quote unquote, anoint the cannons. And he privately puts a gold piece on each of the cannon's touch holes and apologizes for having forgotten. Now, the Master Parker smiles broadly, thanks him, tells him, it's always been the custom, and he doesn't want to see the old ways die. And he'll have Jack's cannon swung onto the Sophie in 5 minutes' time. And boom, he does.
Oh, petty corruption. You've got to love it, right?
Yeah, exactly. Petty corruption and, the custom of the way things work in certain places. I remember, decades and decades and decades ago, I was working in India. And, my consulting partner's wife, we'd gotten word back home in the States, she was really sick. And he headed, back across India to the airport to get back to the States as quickly as possible. But, I got a call a couple hours later that he had a ticket and he was waiting to get placed on a plane. He was really kind of panicked. I could see Jack in him now reading this story. And, remembering where we were, I said, have you tipped anybody yet? And he called back minutes later to say he's on board, upgraded to first class, and ready to take off. Got to anoint those cannons.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny, I remember in the chat that we had with Gord Lacker many, many episodes ago, he was talking about this as a real thing, even in his time as a serving officer, that, there are moments where you might have to grease a few wheels ashore to get what you need as an enterprising captain.
Right. Now we understand why Jack had to pledge that everlasting credit
Yeah,
to get ready to go out.
Huh. But it's early in the day, so he's not yet done. I wonder how much deeper he's going to have to reach into his pocket. I wonder how much more resourceful he's going to have to be. Well, let's see. Everyone is watching how these guns are going to go aboard the Sophie to see if the timbers can take the weight. And O'Brien does a really nice job bringing us right there with him. We get the creaking and the groaning. First of all, it appears that it's not too bad. And the main problem is that there's not enough room for these guns and all these people on this small ship. And there's a slightly comic situation of just how difficult it is to get these guns into place. Jack backs up. He takes a step or two backwards from the gun, and we get this really comic little interlude described in very low-key way of all these people stepping back and bumping into each other, a chain reaction resulting, as the text says, in the maiming of one ship's boy and very nearly in the watery death of another. It's really funny, but a little bit of a comment about the cheapness of life, but it's like, Jack is in authority, and he's miles away from some of the consequences that his actions have on some of these people.
Nicely put.
Yeah. So he wants to get this cannon secured quickly. He's about getting the breeching all kind of tied up there. If the ship rolls and the untied cannon should roll with it, it could drop through the open hatch, and that's the end of the Sophie. So he's in a big hurry to get this all tied up and squared away. And we have this interesting little dialogue here, Mike, between Jack and the bosun about a particular kind of splice.
Right. I shudder to remember it.
Well, Jack says to preserve our non-explicit rating, we're going to use the polite form of the word without the N in it, ladies and gentlemen. Okay. So Jack says a simple thing like a cut splice will not take a man of war's bosun long. And this is Patrick O'Brien playing with his love of potty humor and our sensitivity about language. The cut splice, in fact, originally was called a very different word, but with the N in it, I think we all know what we're talking about. It's typically used for really, really tight lines, like the log line, where one single splice would tend to come undone when the rope is frequently wet. It makes a very strong knot. A cut splice is a join between two ropes where the side splicing ends up with the sides of the splice slightly apart, so there's like an eye or an opening in the joined rope. And it's really fascinating. Sailors in the 18th century would have called this its original, to our ears now, pretty offensive name. By the time we get to the 19th century, people, even in regular naval life, are referring to this in its politer form as a cut splice. And Mike, it's funny, isn't it? But there's this process of fiddling with the language, if you like, that was playing to people's sensitivities all the way through the 19th century.
Yeah, this is, and I have to admit, this is new to me. I know that people change language and they, put little characters in to leave out vowels and things, but I had never heard about the actual formal name for this, but it was in this definition of this knot, which was great. So it was bowdlerized, or expurgation, I guess, is the other one. This idea of taking a written work and censoring it to take anything that's deemed to be noxious or offensive out of it. Thomas Bowdler, 1818 has kind of edited one of Shakespeare's plays, and this is where this starts, and it has this long history going down. One of the great ironic exceptions that stood out for me, Ray Bradbury had this great book, Fahrenheit 451, all about the burning of books, that people are kind of censoring and burning books. And sure enough, Ballantine Books bowdlerized his book. They changed terrible things like the words hell and damn. Yeah. He had described a drunk man and they called him a sick man. Somebody had talked about cleaning the fluff out of a navel, and they went, no, not a belly button here. We'll clean the fluff out of an ear. So Bradbury, of course, learning about this, was very upset and required them to change it back again.
Wow. And it seems to me, I don't know, I don't think I've read anything about it, but it seems to me that this kind of bowdlerizing attitude to language is the kind of thing that Patrick O'Brien would have really, really been disgusted with. I think he first of all, he enjoyed the knowing that we were authentic in speaking and writing in the way that people spoke and wrote in this period. And I think he likes playing with our visceral reactions to language anyway. He does all these really obscure tricks with sometimes, dashing out curse words and sometimes adding them back in. And he's really playful with that. And I think he's making a little joke here by drawing our attention to this really, to modern ears, really distasteful name for this knot.
Right.
And reminding us that that's the world that he's in, and he's not going to bowdlerize stuff. And good on you.
Yeah. This is it's the humor is one of the things we love about Patrick O'Brian, and it's fun to walk up to this precipice where we're thinking, even I can't go there right now.
Yeah.
well done. So, in the midst of all this, Jack has remembered that he's agreed to meet Stephen for dinner, and he's thinking, gosh, this is all taking so much time. So he takes young midshipman Mowat, the master's mate, and asks him, he knows where Joselita's coffee house is. So he says, go find this Stephen Matron and let him know that we won't be back by dinner, but we'll be happy to pick him up, whenever he tells us this evening. So, and O'Brien, I love it, the way, we talked about how he connects paragraphs. And he said, indeed, they're not back by dinner because they haven't even left by dinner. It's logically impossible. And they're slowly sweeping out of the harbor. And this, Ian, this was just an amazing kind of picture of my mind is to see the Sophie with a bunch of oars here. So I'd love to know, I think we're going to come back to that again in this book, so we'll have to come back to this picture.
At the risk of reusing a phrase that we've used many times before, these might be Chekhov's oars.
Yes.
These sweeps are the name for very long oars used in a relatively full-size ship like a brig, for actually rowing the ship. Like they wouldn't have anything very fancy. They'd just get these long old oars, just like a galley. Not very many. I think there were 4 or 5 aside on the Sophie, and maybe put them through the gun ports. And several men at a time on the loom of each oar, slowly paddling this brig out of the harbor. Not easy to do, not really physically possible to do on a big multi-deck ship like a ship of the line, but on a cute little ship like a brig, it's a possible extra way to get yourself maneuvered in light winds, to get yourself maneuvered at close quarters. So it's a thing.
Ah, nice. Well, and maybe it was a little easier now with these new cannon because she's pretty low in the water.
Yeah, good point.
Right? And Jack has himself taken out in a boat, and he's kind of being rowed all around her to completely check her out. We know that this is the way Jack is. He's always surveying the situation, understanding it. So as he's doing this, he's kind of wondering, how is she going to handle with all this weight? And he's thinking about his ship and his crew. And then he's thinking, you know what? I really should have all the women sent ashore. And when I send the men to dinner here in a minute, because we're just getting out, I could do that. We could do a clean sweep of the whole thing. We could do another sweep tonight and we'll have it all done. But he's still thinking to himself, but the crew really is lacking zeal right now. And he doesn't want them to become sullen. Sullen we'll hear a couple times in this chapter, this, kind of bad-tempered, sulky. And, especially on this test cruise, he wants to see what everybody can do and not have them worried about this. And Jack says, or O'Brien tells us, sailors were as conservative as cats. We know that one, the cat owner.
Yeah.
And he knew very well they would put up with an incredible labor and hardship, to say nothing of danger, but it had to be what they were used to, or they would grow brutish. So, boy, Jack got a reminder of that with the Master Parker this morning, and he doesn't want a repeat of that now with his crew.
So, as Jack is processing what he might be able to do with these cannons and processing exactly how his crew seem to be behaving and thinking about what's it going to take to get them to move things along, he comes back aboard. He delays dinner to take advantage of the wind. They send the new crew members below and they make sail out of Mahon Harbor as men in other ships watch them. So this is Jack's kind of maiden moment where he's going to drop anchor and sail away, sail out of the inlet that is Mahon Harbor. As the book says, he's within sight of all of his peers and all the rest of the kind of professional navy around them. He goes through these orders to get the ship underway, and he exchanges a little glance here with Lieutenant Dillion. They're both thinking, well, how is this going to play out? Are we going to look stupid? And actually, in the end, it's not bad. It's okay, not fantastic, but not disgraceful. At least they know they're not going to get an earful of catcalls and abuse from the other ships lining the harbor. And O'Brien uses this nice metaphor that he uses many times to talk about ships making sail. He talks about as the Sophie spreads her wings. And we get this beautiful kind of poetic image of the Sophie breaking into sail and sailing off down the harbor. Meanwhile, ashore, though, Stephen Maturin's not really sure what's going on. He's been left behind And I think, Mike, he's a bit put out by this spectacle.
Yeah, there's this great little scene where he hasn't quite realized it yet, and he's shown up for dinner. He's a little bit excited. We find out, and he asks this naval officer, which ship is the Sophia? And the man says, "Well, do you mean the sloop Sophie?" And Stephen, I think, with a great little insight into his character as we know and love him, says, "Well, that may well be the case, sir. No man could easily surpass me in ignorance of naval terms."
Yeah.
So the man tries to point out the Sophie. Stephen kind of gets it confused with lots of other ships. And finally, Stephen says, you mean that small, squat merchantman with 2 masts? And the man laughs and says, yeah. Right, that's her, not doing a really smart job of raising her sails. But now she's going to make it out of the harbor easily. And as you say, Stephen is just shocked. He's like, what do you mean? She's sailing away? And, O'Brien tells us that Stephen had met with Mr. Flory. Flory had convinced him that Jack's offer was legitimate, that Stephen would be a really good surgeon. He'd given Stephen the equipment he'd need until his official supplies arrived, and loaned him some books about naval maladies. And, as he's standing there, O'Brien writes, Stephen had allowed his mind to convince itself entirely, and the strength of his emotion at the sight of the Sophie, her white sails and her low hull dwindling fast over the shining sea, showed him how much he'd come to look forward to the prospect of a new place and new skies, a living and a closer acquaintance with his friend, who was now running fast towards the quarantine island, behind which he would presently vanish. And again, as you say, this is not sitting well.
No, it's not. Even though I think if we've read the text carefully, we've realized that Jack has set things in place that he's going to be back. But it's a very far hope to think that Stephen's kept a hold of that. He was already having doubts about whether the offer of a place aboard the Sophie was serious. And he sees the Sophie herself sailing away with apparently no communication from Jack. And I'm like, I'm with him. Like, oh man, that must be really, really disheartening. The day's running away from Jack. Maybe, despite his great plans, Jack is going to stay out there all day, and maybe Stephen's just going to have to give up. Maybe, Mike, it's only the fact that we know these are called the Aubrey Maturin novels that we still hold out hope at this moment that Stephen's going to stay in the story somehow. And the text says that he lets, as O'Brien calls it, he lets all his defenses disperse. He's reassembling his defenses, getting his mood and his optimism back together, calling out his reserves, and he walks by Joselito's coffee house. He had not gone there earlier. He didn't have enough money for coffee. Remember, he's penniless. He's been abandoned by the patient that he was accompanying who had died. And he had been forced to choose basically between having a coffee and finding a boat to take him out to the Sophie.
Right.
And who should come along but Midshipman Mowat? And first of all, we love James Mowat. He's going to be in the story all the way through. Second of all, Stephen's first unguarded response to James Mowat is a little flash of the Stephen that we're all going to know and love. Mowat runs after him and calls, Dr. Maturin, and stopped short, quite shocked by the pale glare of reptilian dislike. However, he delivered his message, and he was relieved to find that it was greeted with a far more human look. And we just get this little flash of Stephen, the cold-hearted, calculating badass that we all know he's going to turn into. And James Mowat's got a flash of it as well. So it's a great moment. So, Mowat goes away, relieved. Stephen Maturin agrees that he's going to meet Jack at the Crown Steps at 6 p.m. That's quite late in the day. He thanks Mowat and goes off to help Mr. Flory with an operation. And this is a moment now for Stephen Maturin, in a slightly more happy mood, to look forward, in his case, to helping out with a surgical operation. He says, it is a great while since I felt the grind of bone under my saw. And he's smiling with the anticipation about this. Well, another insight, I think, in Stephen Maturin, very different from the just generally good-natured, happy-to-have help guy. Very different from just the stumbling naval kind of ignorant lubber. Very different from the passionate natural philosopher as well. There's a piece of cold steel at his heart there, I think.
Yeah. I mean, to have, thought, I've had all these disappointments. I can't take another one. And like you said, reassembling his defenses and his reserves. And then, hey, no, it's all going to work out. And boom, he's right back. But, we watched that that was something. Well, as Stephen is back with the wind in his sails and rolling along, the Sophie is doing the same thing. She's kind of passed by the island, and now she's getting the full wind, and Jack wants to see how close she'll sail to the wind. And the master says, clearly not as close today because of all this weight at the front. So, Jack was worried about the crew turning sullen. Now the ship is essentially turned sullen because of this weight here. And Jack, he steps up and takes the wheel himself. He really wants to feel this ship and be directly in contact with it. And when he does so, his hat blows off and the master just dashes out of it. Marshall grabs it, wipes it with his handkerchief, and kind of supplicating brings it back, offering it to Jack with both hands. And there's this little fascinating thing where one crew member, all of a sudden we've jumped off to somebody else. One crew member says to another, "Old Sodom and Gomorrah is sweet on Goldilocks." Now, he says it, O'Brien tells us no moral judgment here, but his mate says, "Well, I hope you don't take it out of us too much. That's all, mate." He replies to him. Ian, what do you make of this here?
Well, I think it's another little pointer towards the fact that the crew is quite conservative and they've had quite an easy life and they've got their 3-watch system and they've got their cozy little brig. And the person who really governs their sailing life is the sailing master. And if the sailing master is suddenly going to have taken a shine to Captain Aubrey and begin to try and ginger them up into, great heights of performance, that's going to mean a harder life for them than they've had in the past. And I think they're just a bit wary about that.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And Jack gets a great chance here, I think, himself to get in touch with Sophie as a live sailing vessel. I love this description of the Sophie sailing down the harbour of Mahon and around the headland and into the wind. It feels really authentic to me. It feels like Patrick O'Brien's been on the deck of a small sailing ship. I suspect maybe he hadn't. I suspect he's just picked this up from really atmospheric writing by other people. But it's really beautifully put. Jack, we hear, let her pay off until the flurry was over. That means he eases the sheets and steers the boat's head away from the wind a little bit to ease the pressure. Then, as he began to bring her back, his hands strong on the spokes, so he came into direct contact with the living essence of the sloop, the vibration beneath his palm. Something between a sound and a flow came straight up from her rudder, and it joined with the innumerable rhythms, the creak and humming of her hull and rigging. And it's a very, very nice first-person description of what it's like having your hand on the rudder or the steering wheel of a sailing ship. Feels really authentic to me.
Nice.
With his first contact with the ship complete, Jack now feels that it's a good time to send the crew to their dinner. And he's sitting alone. And once again, we get this idea of the loneliness of command. There's no one with whom he can share all of his observations. He realizes at this moment this is his first formal sit-down meal as captain. And Aubrey says to himself, "I shall grow used to it in time," and looked again with his loving relish at the sea.
Yeah. Yeah. And I have this, this picture in my mind, in Master and Commander, the movie, we've got these great scenes of looking, kind of into Jack and Stephen in this cabin on a different ship, but through these big, broad back windows. And he's got smaller, but this back windows across the back of this ship, and he's looking out thinking, I can eat, I can watch the sea that I love, and I want to be there.
It's really lovely, isn't it? Puts us right in the situation with him.
Yeah.
So now that the brig is at sea and Jack is fed and the crew is fed, we can get on with our working day, and that means testing the guns first of all. They try the guns first of all with a half-filled cartridge, so half the load of black powder. After the third shot, the carpenter runs up on deck, begging, supplicating Jack, saying, "Please, please stop. The boat can't take it. The planks are sprung with making water in 5 different places." And Jack is very upset by this scene. He thinks this is very undignified, very unprofessional for the Navy. The supplicating carpenter kind of crawling around on all fours on the deck. Jack, despite his disappointment, agrees with the assessment. These 12-pounders are too much for the poor old Sophie, and the planks can't take it. And he's vexed that his first scheme to upgrade the hardware of the Sophie hasn't paid off. He looked, he says then, with even greater malignance at the main yard. They'd been tacking into the wind, they'd worn once, and this is Jack thinking, now what can I do next to keep going with my upgrade plan? Now, for the crew, that's something that they're doing on a full stomach. For you and me and our listeners, Mike, I think we might want to go and get some refreshment ourselves before Jack puts before the wind and we see how the rest of his experiment on the Sophie pans out. What do you say?
Great idea.
Well, we'll be right back then after this short break. If you're enjoying the podcast, please come and join our supporters on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/lubbershole.
Welcome back. Hope you're refreshed. And Jack is refreshed here, although a bit disappointed. But he decides to learn a little bit more about the ship. So we rejoin him. He's down in his cabin reading through the Sophie's logbook, her record of the ship's days. And it has all the usual, these kind of short notations about the navigation and the weather and how they were sailing, the ships they'd met, what went on that day. Are they escorting the convoy, reading the articles of war, having divine service, all the discipline that's imposed. And Jack's kind of surprised to see that there's a good bit more flogging than he expected, thinking that they were kind of a lax thing. But it's not heavy, he says, what you call that 100 lash stuff. They're floggings for drunkenness and contempt. But he then goes on to say, okay, so he puts the logbook aside, starts to read the muster book, the list of all the ship's company, in this history over time, all the people coming and going, their advancements, their deaths. And his vision once again gets drawn to this beautiful stern window here. And he realizes all of a sudden that he can now do whatever he wants. He can look at the sea and go to sleep. He can do anything because he's got all this privacy. He's never had this on a ship before. But at the moment, he realizes what he's really longing for is human company. And he returns to the deck at 4 bells.
Oh, Jack, ever the extrovert. His energy comes from being in contact with other human. Bless him. Now, as he appears on quarterdeck, his company, as it turns out to begin with, is Dillion and the master, who are there obviously discussing the rigging. And there's a really slight note of disappointment for extrovert Jack, as Dillion and the master respectfully move over to the leeward side of the quarterdeck and they leave him in peace. He's actually pleased with this whole situation, I think. And then he realized that he had no companion unless he called one over. So if he wants some company, he's going to have to kind of make that happen for himself. Meanwhile, he's got all the ship's rigging to look at. He's looked at the ship's performance to evaluate. He made some mental notes about the rigging and ordered the crew to bear up, which in this case I think means head downwind. They've been tacking upwind. Now they're going to turn back towards Mahon and sail downwind again. He orders them to set the square mainsail and change course. Significantly here, Dillion asks, should it be double reefed? And Jack says, no reef at all. And he resumes pacing the quarterdeck. Now, Jack's heart is beating fast, and it might not be super obvious as to why his heart's beating fast. But Mike, let me see if I can try and figure out what's going on here.
Excellent.
His first attempt at a hardware upgrade was the 12-pounder cannons. They didn't work. He's got something that he wants to achieve with this main yard and the mainsail. He didn't have to work very hard to get the cannon. They were available for him as long as he remembered to anoint them with a gold coin. The getting of them was fine. As it turned out, the execution wasn't to be. That plan didn't work out. The getting hold of a main yard, though, that's a different story. And we're going to sort of step by step learn what Jack's thinking is and how he's going to go about it. Sophie is a brig. That means she has 2 masts. The rearmost of those 2 is called the mainmast. On a brig like Sophie, that rear mainmast has 2 main sails. It has what's called a fore and aft mainsail, which has its long edge held tight to the mast, and the sail sets like a wing on its end. And that's great when you're sailing into the wind, when you're maneuvering at close quarters coastally, that's fine. It's not great for making quick passages when the wind is behind you. And for that job, you need a different mainsail. You need the square mainsail. And that looks more like everybody's traditional idea of a sailing ship sail. It's, of course, square. It's set on a yard. That's a long wooden spar that kind of is set roughly across the ship from side to side, and the sailors hung below it in the image that we all know. Now, Jack wants to do lots of fast passages. He wants to chase prizes, and prizes, when he encounters them, are probably going to turn before the wind and run away downwind. So he needs good sailing performance in this downwind direction. His main yard is too weak for the job. And we've already heard in a few different ways that the Sophie's petty officers are a conservative bunch. We know that Mr. Brown prizes naval officers who husband their resources and don't waste stuff. So nobody's going to want to help him get a stronger main yard just to fool around with. So let's see what happens.
All right. Good. Thanks, Ian. Boy, I think so many times, when I first came to Master and Commander, I just really couldn't make head nor tails. And a lot of times still can't make heads or tails of all the nautical jargon. And what pains my heart is when people, as we talked about an episode or two ago, say, oh, well, there's too many nautical terms. I couldn't make it through. And so I think we're trying to help. For people who know all these things, hey, sail along with us. For those of you who don't, sail along with us.
Yeah. Absolutely. By the way, slightly confusingly, in most Patrick O'Brien editions, there's a nice engraving in the front of the book, which is labeled "The Sails of a Square-Rigged Ship Hung Out to Dry in a Calm," which is all fine, except that the little diagram in the front of the book has 3 masts and has square mainsails on all 3 masts. Sophie is a brig. It doesn't really show this fore and aft main, and doesn't show the importance of the square mainsail. So it's a bit unlucky. You'd have to do a little bit of digging for yourself.
So as you said, Ian, we're back aboard the Sophie. They've turned before the wind. They've got the wind coming from behind them, and now they're saying, let's take that front to back, that fore and aft mainsail down and put this square mainsail up, the one that Jack is thinking, that yard that's holding this thing. Yeah, I don't like that. It's not strong enough. So they're picking up speed. They start shooting forward, and the mainsail is as taut as a drum, O'Brien tells us. And Jack even asks the sailmaker if they can get some more cloth on the sail. He talks about a deep goring leech. Don't need to know what that is. He's just sort of saying, can we put some more material? Jack wants to increase the force on this sail to, deal with this yard that he's not too fond of here. And he looks at the sea and the way it's running by the ship. And then he keeps looking back up at that mainyard. And this, this piece of wood, as you say, Ian, that's holding this mainsail, it's like 30 feet long. It's maybe 7 inches thick in the middle. It tapers down to about 3 inches thick at the end. And Jack thinks to himself, this is, more like a crojack than a mainyard. And he's thought this several times. And of course, I'm looking at this going, crojack?
Right. And a crojack is a fairly flimsy thing. It's the spar that holds the bottom corners of the mizzen topsail. Because in a boat with a fore and aft mizzen sail, you don't necessarily have a spar there, so you've got to put a little spindly little supporting spar. A crojack's not a proper man's idea of a spar at all. He's looking for a proper mainyard that's got some beef to it. Now, once the Sophie reaches her top speed, the mainsail's taking the full force of the wind, and there's lots and lots of pressure there. Jack is listening, and he hears it groaning. Now, the carpenter and the boatswain and perhaps Lieutenant Dillion are all hearing that groan and thinking, well, this doesn't sound great. Jack is hearing that groan and thinking, yeah, maybe my plan is going to work. So Jack's looking up at this yard. The officers and most of the experienced hands are looking at the yard as well. Before the wind, the ship was quieter because you're sailing away from the wind, so the apparent wind is a bit less. But still, there's all this pressure in the sail, and the men are murmuring. And Mike, we hear this phrase that we're going to hear quite a few times in the future books about Jack Aubrey and his seamanship. One of the crew says, he'll carry all away if he cracks on so. And O'Brien says, Jack did not hear it. He was quite unconscious of the tension around him, far away in his calculations of the opposing forces, not mathematical calculations by any means. Oh, in parenthesis, he doesn't like math yet. He's coming to be a mathematician much later in his life. So for now, all of his calculations are instinctive. Not mathematical calculations by any means, but rather sympathetic. The calculations of a rider with a new horse between his knees and a dark hedge coming. But right, there's a great bit of characterization for Jack, and this idea of Jack imagining himself as the rider on a powerful horse, we're going to come back to that again and again and again. It's going to be one of O'Brien's favorite motifs, I think, for Jack's character.
Yeah. And as a rider, I'm married to a horse whisperer, I can tell you, it's not the physics and the trigonometry that you're grabbing up there, right?
Yeah.
Oh.
So Jack goes below once again. He's looking out of his beautiful stern window. They pass Cape Mola. Cape Mola is the big cape that's right at the entrance to Port Mahon. So they're a fairly long way to being back home again. The wind is going to be deflected by the coast, and that's going to increase the thrust, and there's even more pressure now going to be building on this square sail. And the text says Jack was quite sort of insouciant about this. Very quietly, it says, he whistled De Vieni, reflecting, if I make a success of this, and if I make a mint of money, several hundred guineas, say, the first thing I shall do after paying off is go to Vienna, to the opera. And Mike, I love this reference to De Vieni. He's talking about Mozart, I'm pretty sure. There are 2 arias in 2 different Mozart operas that begin with the text of De Vieni, which means come. There's one called De Vieni non tardar, come, don't be late, which is beautiful. It's in Marriage of Figaro, and we know from all of our other reading that Marriage of Figaro was a favorite reference for Patrick O'Brian. But Mike, you found this the reference in Don Giovanni as well, and I think this is even better. Don Giovanni, this opera with the kind of light comic side and the dark foreboding side, with this guy who's at once a red-blooded seducer of women, and on the other side, a superstitious mortal doomed by his own self-aggrandizement. It's a really, really interesting kind of duality in this opera. Maybe, if you want to say, Don Giovanni's version of De Vieni is the one, partly because it's a very, very tuneful tune. You can imagine Jack singing it. Partly because it's a romantic man singing about, come to the window. And partly because it sets up the Jack Aubrey happy-go-lucky side of Don Giovanni, and that's going to be in contrast to the broody, dark, maybe Stephen Maturin side of the rest of the story of Don Giovanni. So I love it. Let's play a little bit of De Vieni alla Finestra from Don Giovanni.
De vieni alla finestra, o mio tesoro, te vieni a consolare il pianto mio.
So there you go, a little snatch of Don Giovanni there. Mike gets a really, really great reference.
It is. And it's another one of these opportunities that O'Brian gives us to just dig in and for fun, not, we've had some great chats recently on the Patrick O'Brian appreciation page about literary criticism. Neither of us are literary critics, but we do love these characters and we love these references and love to think, kind of what does this all mean? What might it mean? What's going on here as we journey together with Stephen and Jack? So, Dillion comes to the cabin to report that the wind is increasing. And I think he's, ever more urgently asking, for permission to reduce sail. And Jack says, no, but then he thinks to himself, I can't, Dillion's got the watch right now. He's up there all alone. I'm making him, proxy for this decision. And he says, you know what, I'll be up on deck in 2 minutes. But he's not. He's up on deck in 1 minute, just in time to hear this ominous, rending crack. And bam! So Jack is furiously giving orders. They get this mainsail down. The yard, this main yard that he's talking, is hopelessly sprung. It's completely given out here. And Jack looks out and says, lay her for the harbor, Mr. Dillion, if you please. Boom mainsail and everything she can carry. There is not a minute to lose.
So, some really lovely things paying off there. The crew were right. Something did carry away from him cracking on. He's going to get to go back here and see if he can make his move to get a better yard from Mr. Brown. And This is crazy. This is Jack all in one day, taking his ship out, wrecking a critical part of it, and bringing it back. Crazy like a fox, this guy is.
Right. 45 minutes later, Jack has the sprung yard dragging, kind of being pulled behind a boat that's taking him back to the dockyard to see Mr. Brown here. And after he's out of the boat, one of the crew members that's been rowing in here says, well, there's the fleet's own brazen smiling serpent. And he, he's watching Jack run up the stairs. And, he says he brings the poor old Sophie in first time he could ever set foot on her, with barely a yard standing at all. Her timbers all crazy, half the ship's company pumping for dear life, and every man on deck the livelong day, dear nose with never a pause for the smell of a pipe. And he runs up them old steps smiling like King George was up there to knight him. And so he's we got a little view into the crew's view of Jack right now. And one of his mates there in the boat says, yeah, and a short time for dinners will never be made up. And we've got this very young Mr. Babington who, in his little young voice, O'Brien tells us, musters as much courage as he can manage, saying, silence, trying to preserve the captain's dignity. But I can't help wondering, if he isn't a little bit confused too, what the heck is going on here?
Yeah, he's seen this, what looks like wanton destruction aboard the ship. He can see that the crew are out of sorts. This new captain, is he acting with authority? Is he just a chancer? But by the way, I love as well the fact that we hear about this in this reported dialogue coming from the member of the ship's crew pulling on the oar. Again, a thing that O'Brien's going to come back to time and time again, giving us a little bit of action, but adding character to it by having us, a secondary character play it out for us and describe it for us. So here we go. Jack's plan starts to become visible to us. He tells Mr. Brown, you can do me an essential service. And he says, well, the convoy ship is in. That's the ship called the Fanny. He needs to sail tonight. He needs his main yard condemned and a new one issued. Brown is shocked. But what's going on here? Jack says, I'm bringing back the 2 12-pounders since ordnance is now under your purview. And he's greasing Mr. Brown up a little bit by saying, I know that you're now in charge and Mr. Head is now your subordinate. I don't want the Sophie to be overburdened with these heavy cannon. And Mr. Brown says, with all my heart. But Brown reports that there's no spar in the yard small enough for the Sophie. And Jack is on top of this right away. He says, yes, that's true. But the Généreux, this ship that we mentioned last time in connection with Cochrane, the Généreux has 3 spare foretop-gallant yards. And the foretop-gallant yard would normally be smaller than a main yard, but that's the foretop-gallant yard of a big ship would work, we think, perhaps at least in terms of its diameter, as the main yard for a small brig. So let's see. Mr. Brown says, okay, I'll give you one on trial and see if it fits.
So, they're getting the spar to the ship, and Mr. Lamb, the carpenter, just marvels at it. He says, now that's what I call a real spar. 43 foot, as clean as a whistle. You'll spread a mainsail as a mainsail on that, sir. So I think the carpenter, Mr. Lamb, is starting to get with the program here. Jack directs him on how to bring the spar aboard and how to install it. Earlier, Jack was not only he wasn't happy about the main yard, he also wasn't happy about how it was rigged. And now he's telling them how he wants this one rigged here. Mr. Brown says, that's way too big. You're going to have to saw off the ends and a good bit more. But Jack kind of, takes it his own way. He directs the bosun, and he gives him this approach that the bosun thinks would only be done inside Bedlam. In other words, he's only somebody in a mental institution would come up with this thing here. And instead of doing, as Brown had said, to cut all this extreme amount off, Jack tells the carpenter just to trim the ends, in a very little bit until it has just enough here. And Lamb doesn't get it at first, but then he is amazed. He sees where Jack is going with what he's got the bosun doing, what he's got him doing. And with their work complete, Jack says, go ahead and sway it up, pop her up, because I'm going to shore. And so in the middle of it, he's gotten it just right. And then he leaves. He leaves and says, remember, We got to be ready to sail by the evening gun. And then he turns to Dillion. Dillion, who's, I'm sure thinking about, my God, I kept telling him about this and he's done this. And now what are we doing here? He says to Dillion, by the way, put all the women ashore. As he says, women are capital things in port, but they will not do at sea. So Dillion, he's like, okay, Jack doesn't want to do this, doesn't want to upset the whole crew. Dillion, you do this while I'm gone. And he takes the boat back to the dockyard. So what's happened?
It's a really great maneuver. And by the way, I don't know exactly that I've got this right. So if anybody's listening that the intricate details of square rigging a ship, get in touch and tell us. Here's what I think is happening. The normal way that you would rig this main yard would be that you'd put the slings and all the braces and everything all in place, and then it would be there. But what Jack's actually saying is he wants to trim it so that he takes just enough off the end so that it will just fit and no more. So he hoists it just in its slings without any of the rest of the gubbins, so he can see exactly how wide is wide enough but not too wide so it won't fit. And while it's lying there in the slings, he has the carpenter go through this kind of business. So he's done this, what you might call the switcheroo maneuver, very, very quickly, crudely hoisting up this yard, temporarily hanging it there, trimming it so it's just small enough but no smaller. Planing the yarm ends, all this business with their stunsail boom end irons and the stop cleats is what he's doing there. He gets himself, as a result, in really short order, a strong new main yard, as long, that is to say, wide as it possibly can be and still fit, and it's kind of carrying everybody along with him. And I love he's using the energy and the charisma of a buoyant, young, gung-ho captain, and he's carried everyone along with him. Mr. Brown doesn't spot the right moment to say, hold on a second, young man. The bosun and the carpenter are in no position to stop him. Dillion, I think, is just standing there open-mouthed. And it really helps him that he can use that great Jack Aubrey catchphrase. He says, there's not a moment to lose.
Right. Well, at the dockyard, it's interesting, as you said, Ian, kind of this charisma, this way that Jack's kind of, completely in command of these things. Mr. Brown, now says, well, Jack's going to be really happy that he took, Mr. Brown's advice with this new spar, because if he hadn't, it would have carried away in the first puff of wind. But in fact, as you just said, and as we know, he hadn't taken Brown's advice at all. So, and he's, rigged it in this way that's going to make it work now. But Jack doesn't even reply to that remark. He just says, Mr. Brown, I'll take those duettos now. I'll take that music. You were going to get me. and he says, and by the way, I'm about to go fetch my friend and can't wait to bring him around for you to meet him and introduce him to Mrs. Brown the next time we're in Mahan. So he continues to march forward, carry everybody, now smiling and perhaps scratching the back of their heads with him here.
Yeah, and what is his thoughts now turn to the social side of things? He's got to go ashore. He's got to organize a dinner. He's got to sit down with Masha. It's like he's having a day of days. He's really, really on fire. Very opposite, I think, from all the uncertainty and all the kind of doggedness in Stephen Maturin's mind. Jack Aubrey has absolutely hit his stride here. I think it's really, really great. He runs back to the boat. He's sweating. He says, get over quickly to the crown steps. Give way, he says, like heroes. Give way is the order that you were given a rowboat to say, okay, row your oars. Give way is nautical speak for row. You give way like heroes. He arrives at the crown steps with 6 minutes to spare. He apologizes to Stephen for ratting, or maybe appearing to rat on him for dinner, has 2 crewmen come with him, and the rest of them rowed offshore to deliver them from temptation. Now he's got this great kind of cornucopia of ship's crew. He doesn't want to lose any of them. And by the way, that nice little nod to the Lord's Prayer there. He makes a few quick purchases. Well, he wants to make a few quick purchases. He tells Stephen they'll have to wait until their first convoy stop to buy really decent provisions. So for the time being, it's going to be kind of sailors' rations, but never mind. He has one seaman go away with Stephen to get his dunnage, his luggage, and the cello. And I love this moment. He quietly gives Stephen this advance on his pay, saying you may choose not to appear particular, so you might want to go along with this custom of accepting an advance on your pay. Very diplomatic of Jack, and Stephen accepts it just well enough, so he says, okay, I'll take a few guineas. It's a really, really lovely moment, and they're almost all set.
They are. Jack, he takes the other seamen with him and says, we'll meet you back at 6:15. And O'Brien tells us that at 6:15, they're already shoving off in a very crowded boat with all the men and the cello and the bags and Stephen. And when they reach the Sophie, they make sure that Stephen gets up the side. A brilliant idea, as we'll come to find out.
Yeah.
And Jack shows Stephen to the cabin. He apologizes that he has to go immediately on deck, because they're in a real hurry here.
Jack turns to Mr. Dillion. Mr. Dillion, he said, is all well? Dillon's reply, all's well, sir. The 12 merchantmen have made their signal. Very good, says Jack. Fire a gun for them and make sail if you please. I believe we shall just get down the harbour with topgallants if this fag end of a breeze still holds. And then, out of the lee of the Cape, we may make a respectable offing. So make sail. And by then it will be time to set the watch. A long day, Mr. Dillion. Dillion says, a long day, sir. At one time, says Jack, I thought it would never come to an end. And Mike, the end of a long day, the end of a long and really, really rewarding chapter.
Yeah, it really is. An amazingly long, an amazingly good chapter. And I'm sort of wondering in my own mind now, we're kind of upbeat and feeling really good here at the moment, but I'm thinking back, so hold on, all told, stem to start, is this an auspicious or inauspicious beginning for Jack Aubrey in his first command? I know where Jack's head is perhaps, but I'm kind of wondering where everybody else's head is.
Yeah. And it's funny, isn't it, that in lots of other stories, you'd think a story of, scrambling out of the harbour, breaking a key piece of equipment, coming back in a hurry, and just about getting your friend on board. That sounds like a setup for a disaster. But actually, with Jack Aubrey and all his kind of charisma and bounce, it actually sounds like, he played his cards and he played them well, and his day ended well. It's great. This certainly feels like we're ending on a high at the end of this chapter.
At the same time, we're thinking about Stephen and Jack. There are going to be these two really relative strangers holed up in this tiny little cabin as Jack's trying to work out his first command. Their first thing is, boom, here it is. Here's the cabin. Got to go on deck. And with this, up and down that we've seen a little bit of that, we've seen now kind of multiple sides of both of them. And they do seem very different in a lot of ways. They've both been slighted by each other. And we know that they could also do each other a lot of good, right? Stephen gets a place, a chance to see some of the world. Jack gets a surgeon, and perhaps more importantly, the company of a peer, or at least a peer on this trip where, Stephen's his guest and not a reporting officer.
Yeah, and that might be important, but it also makes him a bit unusual as captains in the Navy go. And meanwhile, Mike, what about the war? This is supposed to be a book about sailing ships in the Napoleonic Wars. What about the French and the Spanish? We're 86 pages in. We've had barely a sniff of an admiral or a prize or cannons or a mission or coded letters. Surely something's going on here.
Yeah. I don't think Hornblower would be in this situation, right?
No, right? No, there'd be powder smoke already. And by the way, Dillion, we don't know much about him apart from this uneasiness between him and Stephen. We know he seems really capable. He seems to have been a little bit ignored by Jack on his first outing. He hasn't had much agency. He hasn't been able to be very resourceful. And Jack said Dillion probably has a better call on being a commander than Jack has. So maybe there's going to be some jealousy there. And what about this Irish connection? There are lots and lots of questions still to be answered here, Mike.
Yeah, it is amazing that, in in 2 chapters, O'Brien has really set the board up for us. And I don't know that there's any way to find out what happens next other than to pull chapter 3 down off the shelf next week. Ian, what would you say to a little bit more Patrick O'Brien next week?
Mike, there's not a moment to lose.
Jack wants 2 new cannons and a new main yard.
Yeah, me too. Me too, man.
That's right. It was on my Christmas list, right? That's what I told Santa.